when I started getting involved in finding out about cohousing in 1999, I came to Sunward, um, and I got to see it before the Common House. I guess the Common House was built, but the buildings weren't built yet. And at that time, it was being built on a piece of land that was purchased by the residents. So everybody had to put together a lot of money that they had available to them, and they purchased the land together. Paul, were you part of that group at the beginning?
I was, yeah.
So I think one of the things that tells you about the people who lived at Sunward was that they were the pioneers. They really wanted this to happen. They had a vision. They had a sense of like risk that they were willing to do. Like it was a big deal at that time. They had to put a lot of money and risk, personal risk, into making this happen. But they probably had done some thinking about this and made some good decisions about it. And they probably had enough money in their own lives that they were able to provide that. So it wasn't a ton of young families. Is that right, Paul?
Yep, that's exactly right.
So then Great Oak, when it happened a couple years later, was populated mostly by people who couldn't yet afford or were not in a personal position to decide to get involved in a project of that scope. But Great Oak was created by developers. So that some folks who lived at Sunward developed the land. They purchased it, and then they made it available to people to pay mortgages so that they didn't have to pay so much of a down payment. It was still a lot, but it wasn't quite as risky, and they didn't have to have as much of a chunk of change up front. So when Great Oak began, it was immediately populated by these families who were interested. And they tended to be younger. They tended to be people who still kind of knew about cohousing, but maybe had just started their lives together. And then eventually, Touchstone happened a couple years later than that, also developed by the same people. But Touchstone was primarily created out of people who had never heard of cohousing before, because they ran out of folks who already knew about what this was. At that time, nobody knew what this was. Like it was still 2004, 2002 is when we began meeting together. And I was the only one who was involved in that group. And like everybody else was like, oh, that sounds interesting. So like they wanted to know more, but they didn't have the background knowledge. They didn't have the drive to do it their own personal way. They kind of were willing to be led. They were willing to be explained to, and to do some self-discovery. So maybe a little more open to flexible thinking, but also just not as clear about their own path. So maybe they were less motivated to do it their own specific way. So it really makes for a very different tone to each of the three communities. And even now, that's reflected in the makeup of the communities. And certainly that has changed a lot over time. Sunward's been around a long time now, and then they've had a lot of turnover, and there's been new families that are involved. But that is one of the features of cohousing, is that it kind of renews itself every decade or so with a new group of people, a new generation.
Yeah, and I think you did a really good job explaining that. And I did a little, mental count around the community, probably a year ago. And I think we have about just under 50% of the people here are original people.
Wow.
So you're right about the renewal and the turnover. But yeah, there's still a lot of that original spirit that we originally started with. So. Yeah, it's interesting.
So Paul, how would you describe the differences between the three communities? Personality-wise, you put three groups of people together, they're different flavors.
So when that gets asked on a tour, I normally, it's a bit of a shortcut and a cop-out, but I say that, the three communities, and we're kind of like, three siblings, so we have similar DNA, but there's a little bit of a sibling rivalry, there's some love, there's, and then because of what Maggie was talking about, Sunward does tend to skew older now that we've been around for 20 years, and kids that were born here are thinking of coming back and buying a unit. So, yeah, and so that's how I describe it, and that the other communities tend to skew on the younger side, and I kind of leave it at that.
I don't know if this is accurate or not, but my impression is that Sunward is a little hippier, a little bit more laid back in their ways. Live it, let live kind of feeling. Is that
Yeah,
your sense?
there's definitely a I don't know if libertarian is the right word, but there was some of that feeling.
And Touchstone is more techy, little bit. Great Oak seems really just organized. Like, this is how we do it. Jump on board, kind of, and they can really like make things happen pretty well.
Yeah.
I don't know if other people have that impression or other impressions, but
Yeah.
but each group has sort of a different personality in a way, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the advantages for sure, because not only do you have to like be willing to live with the people in your group, but you can also seek out resources from all of the other three groups, and that makes for a lot broader range of resources and capacity than most groups have. This is unique and special.
Well, I remember when Touchstone decided to build our common house. One of the first things we did was to talk to Great Oak and Sunward. What did you like best about your common house? What would you be sure to do if you were doing it again? And what would you do differently if you were doing it again? And so we were able to start with a lot of their wisdom, and it helped us have a very nice common house.
And really, we did that all the way along. When we were building our homes, we had the benefit of the things that we learned along the way. Touchstone being the third community, we had the advantage of listening to what the other communities said. Oh, we would never do this again, or we really like this part of our community, and learning from that. So that's a huge benefit as well.
When Touchstone was originally built, the plan was to make 46 units. They got 34 built, and along came the recession, so that for a while there was no new building going on. More recently, the original developer has reopened the area that was originally planned for the last 12 units, and they're busy now building the units, which it's hard to say exactly when they'll be done because of all the delays and so forth. But hopefully, I would say this calendar year, we ought to get people in. And there's a bunch of 2-bedroom units and some with walkout basements or attic space. And then there are several townhouse units. And there are ways to get more information about these and to see plans about it.
So Betsy, I believe the floor plans and the pricing and everything's on our website, as well as last fall we had some filmmakers come through and do a short video that is also on our website, and that's called Planet Community, and it's episode 4, and that's a video of all 3 of our communities, so you can really see co-housing sort of in action.